Hey everyone, welcome back to yet another episode of On My Mind. As always, there's been a gap since the last episode, but my usual excuse, I've been on the road and traveling, is still valid for this time as well. A lot of things to talk about. The industry keeps on doing exciting things. The uncertainty in the Middle East continues. You may recall my last On My Mind video about 3 or 4 weeks ago where I predicted, we'll see if I'm right or wrong, that in the end we'll have some kind of a status quo in the Gulf, and that we'll end up paying a toll to the Iranians one way or the other in the long term. At the time, a lot of people said I was crazy. I did get some negative feedback saying that, this is not ever going to happen. Well, we've had a ceasefire, we've had some breaks in the ceasefire, but it looks like the Iranians are going to maintain their control of that strait and demand some kind of a payment. It remains to be seen whether it's a long term thing or not. But I think for we as an industry need to think about what happens if that is a long term, and if that's going to make an implication on how much we are prepared to pay for the LNG that comes out of the Middle East, and whether we ready to accept the risk in case that straits ever closes again, which is of course always a possibility. So let's just see how that prediction works out. We're still in the early stages of that, and I still stand by it. So what I want to talk about today is a few different subjects. I've been spending a little bit of time in Europe in the last couple of months, and there is a lot going on with the European regulation that could have a big impact on the industry. There's three different things that are kind of seem different, but they all kind of relate to each other, or they all kind of connect to each other. The most immediate issue is the methane regulations. For those of you not familiar with, the EU is basically saying that by the end of this year, all LNG importers into the EU have to be able to report their methane emissions, which is the fugitive emissions more than likely. These are obviously methane is our product, so we want to reduce that emissions as much as possible because it's a waste. But along the supply chain, there could be some leaks of methane and flaring of the upstream. There could be some leaks of methane along the pipeline. There could be some leaks of methane in the liquefaction plant and then in the shipping. And the EU wants a reporting of this. I'll get to that, whether that makes sense or not. The second regulation that has come through is that by the end of this year, the EU is going to cut to get rid of all LNG imports and mostly pipeline imports, I think, as well, from Russia. So you have these two things kind of working against each other. On one hand, making it harder to import LNG. On the other hand, saying that you're not going to take LNG from Russia, so you better import more LNG. And the third thing, which has been kind of lingering for the last couple of years, is the carbon, is how much carbon is emitted when you actually produce the LNG, and also when you consume the LNG in Europe. So there has to be some kind of a carbon reporting of this. So these three things just seem to be, I think, remnants. The two things, the two environmental things, are remnants of the green policies of the last decade, which may or may not have worked very well for Europe. And the middle one, which is the Russian one, is obviously a very political thing against Russia, and make sure that Russia does not reestablish a market foothold in Europe once the war is over. So, what do I think of all this? First is it's actually all these regulations, the two environmental regulations really do have a big impact on the US. The US is now the largest supplier of LNG to Europe. I had the opportunity to visit the LNG import facility in Lithuania a couple of weeks ago. And while I was there was a ship from Louisiana. So, no surprise, the US is now the largest supplier of LNG to Europe. And Europe is getting increasingly dependent on that LNG. At that conference I was at, they actually signed a deal for Ukraine to get LNG through the Lithuanian terminal. Again, landlocked countries, or not completely landlocked, but kind of landlocked countries such as Ukraine and others, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia, all of these are now increasingly dependent on LNG as they look at the supplies of Russia reaching an end. For the US suppliers, this methane regulation is particularly a problem. Just to kind of understand how the US works versus everywhere else. Everywhere else, I can say, except maybe US and Canada, but everywhere else other than North America, the LNG is produced from the gas is produced from a defined field, goes down a defined pipeline to a defined LNG facility, and then gets liquefied there and then gets sent to wherever it's going to go. In the US, we do not have that integrated chain. We have a chain the LNG plant is sitting on the pipeline network. Gas could come into that network from anywhere in the country or even from Canada. We have some idea where this gas is coming from, but not a great idea because that upstream of us, the pipelines are all connected. Molecules show up from different basins. Every basin, the Marcellus, the Permian, the Haynesville, the Canadian basins, they're all very different in chemistry of the gas. So the gas is going to be obviously very different from as it gets mixed into one big cocktail. And there's countless suppliers and interactions along the way, custody transfers. We, as sitting in the LNG plant at the very end of the chain in the US, have very little visibility of what has happened to the gas along the way. I cannot even begin to even imagine how I'm going to report methane emissions that an upstream producer in the Marcellus may have done that I need to now account for in Louisiana, because I don't know how much of the gas is coming from that guy. I don't know how much of it came and when it came and how long it took to come to my plant and how many other suppliers from the Haynesville pumped into the same pipeline grid that I got, how many other guys came from the Permian. It is all one big system. The analogy is if I am taking water from the tap in my house, I don't know if it came, I know it comes from the water company, but did the water company get it from a reservoir? Did it get it from a river? Did it get it from a desalination plant? Did it get it from a recycle plant that recycles water? I have no idea. I have no visibility on this. I can make some very crude estimates, but those estimates are going to be incredibly wrong. So the fact that the Europeans are now saying by the end of this year, we're supposed to report our methane kind of footprint, our methane emission footprint at the LNG plant, I think it's going to be impossible for us to do. And I think the US government is also understanding that. So they're pushing back. And the US producers are pushing back to EU saying, look, we are your biggest producer. Do you really want us to shut down? Because the onus is now falling on the importers in Europe. The importers in Europe have to tell their governments where their imported LNG is coming from and what the methane emissions of that imported LNG are. So we're just going to say the consequences of that is the importers, the utilities in Europe, the traders, etc., are just going to stop buying American LNG. But where are they going to get it from? Because this whole rule regulation has been opposed by Qatar, by the US, by Nigeria, by Algeria, and about 11 of the EU member states themselves. So it's inevitable to me that this rule is not going to come into force by the end of this year. But this just adds another uncertainty that I think the Europeans are making it harder for themselves. The Europeans are not doing well economically. They're getting increasingly dependent on other parts of the world for their energy and for many other things. And costs are a major issue for the European consumers. Do you really want to add more difficulty in making the import facilities, the importers pay more cost to get gas that maybe has that reporting? Maybe the Qataris can because they know the field is coming from. Maybe they don't want to report it because there is a lot of emissions. Maybe they don't want to make the investment to cut down those emissions. But at the end of the day, I think Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot. Uh, Again, the carbon regulation, which came out a couple of years ago, was also saying something similar, that we need to account for all the carbon that is involved in the liquefaction, in the shipping, as well as when it gets emitted, that gets consumed in the US, in Europe. I think it's just a lot of reporting, a lot of paperwork. We all should try to reduce that carbon. I think we are working on reducing that carbon, but by making these rules very difficult to oblige, I think we're just going to see the cost go up. Just to repeat, methane is our product. So we'd have every incentive not to release and waste that product. But for us to be able to fully account for that methane everywhere along the value chain, I think it's going to be impossible to do. I think we're trying to ask the Europeans to delay this for another 5 years. I don't know what's going to change in 5 years. The system is going to stay the same. I don't know how we can ever meet this. I guess what bothers me a little bit is the US government is getting involved and they're saying, hey, if Europe doesn't change the rules, we're going to go elsewhere. I hate the governments to get involved because, again, it makes LNG more political. We want LNG to be commercial decisions. I don't know if the government is going to make a much of a difference. We producers can tell the Europeans we cannot meet that compliance. I don't know whether I want the US government making threats, but that's a different story. Uh, I think it is significant that the middle thing, which is Europe saying that no Russian gas is going to go off past 2027. I don't know how robust that's going to be once the war ends. The war looks like it's kind of going into Ukraine's favor. The war could end. I hope it ends soon, but it's going on for 5 years now. But if it does end soon, expect the Russians to flood Europe with very, very cheap gas to get the market share back, to get their revenues back up again, to restore some of their companies and their upstream assets. And this rule is going to make it very difficult for the Europeans to do that. I think there's going to be an enormous political pressure by the consumers to say, let's go ahead and let European gas come in again. I hope that doesn't happen because we cannot trust the Russians. This is a short-term thing. Russian is going to use the gas as their weapon. They have for the last decade. We seem to forget about it. But in the end, cheap gas is going to make a difference. I think it's going to be very hard for the European importers and the European consumers to fight that cheap gas. I'm glad there's going to be a European rule stopping the import of Russian gas, but how strong that wall is going to be, it remains to be seen. One thing I did like in Europe was kind of get to witness how the regional LNG chains are developing around the Baltics, where I was. It's becoming a very nice integrated chain between the small F or the smaller LNG receiving terminals, the pipeline suppliers, and small barges and different LNG vehicles moving gas around. This I think the Baltics are one of the most integrated place where you have barges coming in from Norway, you have big ships coming in from the US, big ships coming in from Norway, pipeline grid. Everybody's integrated, everybody's moving gas around quite efficiently, and gas is being used for ship bunkering, gas is being increasingly used for other transportation fuels as well. Having that integrated chain between the large importers and the small regional suppliers and regional transportation is fantastic. I would love to see it repeated. We see a little bit in the Mediterranean, not enough. We see a little bit in the Caribbean, again, not enough. The potential, we see very little, if any, in the Southeast Asia. We do see some up and down the China coast, but not enough. Uh, I can see a lot of nodes around the world where hub and spoke, where we can actually bring in LNG from big ships and supply it to regional smaller markets, smaller importers, smaller ports, smaller power stations. That would be fantastic to see. I think we need to get that more developed. There are rules such as the Jones Act in the US that stop American flag ships going from American port to American port is silly. It's self-defeating. We have the same rule in Australia and some other countries as well. We need to make LNG cheaper and easier to move in a regional basis. That's going to grow the market, cut emissions, and get people moved away from coal and liquid fuels for transportation. So that's going to be a big thing. I saw that in the Baltics and I was quite impressed by that. I hope we see that repeated in other places. Last couple of more things I want to talk about. Startup. The consultants among us tend to think, hey, the piece of paper says that LNG the project will FID X date. It'll start up 3 years later, and it starts up with full volume. That's never the case. It starts up in a slow way. Startup is always painful. Startup is difficult when you have a massive plant like an LNG liquefaction plant. Takes a while for all the units to work. Startup in LNG Canada took a couple of years, a year or two. Startup in Golden Pass is taking a lot of time. Golden Pass is 15 million plus LNG facility, Exxon and Qatar on the US Gulf Coast, on the Texas side of Sabine River. Supposed to initially start up in 2024, moved to 2025, finally started up in 2020, I think earlier this year or late last year. And we have, I think early this year, and we have only had 3 cargoes in about 3 months. So it's obviously having some trouble at startup. It's actually gone offline for a couple of days this week. Startup is never easy, but it tells you that these things can slip by years and years. And when you look at a forecast or the consultants say, oh, there's going to be a massive surplus in 2030 because all these projects are going to come online at once, that's not going to happen. Projects don't come online when they're going to say they are. They come online slowly. They take years to ramp up to full capacity. Some of them advertise startup date, but it could be three trains, and the first train may be starting up at that time. The other trains could be years later. So take all these supply forecasts with a grain of salt. Projects, of course, get delayed all the time, but even startup dates, even big companies like Exxon, remember, they said a Golden Pass will start up in 2024. Here we are in the middle of 2027, and we have only seen three cargoes. When it finally happens, who knows? I hope it happens well for them. But at the end of the day, forecasts are notoriously wrong. So keep those forecasts in mind. I don't think there's going to be a big surplus in 2030 like everybody's talking about. I've been in the business now 30, 40 years, and there's always a surplus 3 years away. That surplus keeps on kicking down the road. So let's see. I like to end with the fact that I think a lot of you have downloaded my gas units app that converts 95 gas units from in volume, rates, and prices. It's totally free, no ads, no subscriptions, no login. Only for the iPhone right now. Go to the App Store, type in my name, or type in gas units. You'll see it right away. It's an orange icon flame. I'm still working on getting it on the Google Play Store, proving a bit more harder than I think. Google has made it extremely hard to get new apps on the Play Store. We're working on it. But in the meantime, everybody with an iPhone, go ahead and get the Gas Units app. Give me some feedback. I think it's an incredible tool. 95 units in MMBTUs to meters cubed to petajoules to LNG units, rates, MMBTU per day to LNG per year to cubic meters per month. Everything it does is there. Even prices, dollars per megawatt hour to dollars per MMBTU, or units, currency units per MMBTU, currency units per from cubic meters to currency units per tons of LNG. It does everything. It's approximate, but I think it works really well. I hope you download it. That's all I have to say for today. Keep the comments coming, and I'm glad you guys are following me. Do hit follow, but again, I just do this for fun, and I hope you do it. Gulfstream LNG, a few things. We are continues to make very good progress on our environmental submissions. We have submitted most of our environmental second draft reports now to the U.S. government. We will be done with all the environmental work this summer. We are now looking at finishing most of our technical work in the next few months. Feed has started. FERC feed, we call it. FERC feed has started for a lot of the work. We are still looking for a bit more money to complete the rest of FERC feed. So expect that. I'm still on track to get the FERC permit, I hope, by the early part of next year. And we'll see what happens for FID after that. And I'm still hoping Texas LNG, my older project, announces some big announcements in the very near future. So keep a lookout for that. Great. Thank you very much. Bye.